This is the podcast for week 6. We cover chapters 10 and 11, community politics and participation. Let's get started on the questions. First one is, how does local politics differ from state and national? Well, here are some of the basic differences. Particularly, keep in mind that politics changes as you go from national to state and then state to local. In other words, the characteristics or what I'm talking about apply more to local than they do to state, but the differences between the national and the state and the difference between the state and the national and the local are greater. That's basically what I'm saying. So um, let's go into the characteristics and you'll see what I mean. The first one is amateur politics. Most of the people involved in local politics um, are amateurs. In other words, this is the place where they start their political career if they have a political career. Actually, most people, this is where they begin and end their political career. Very few people go on to something else. So amateurs means you have no experience, little or no experience in politics, never held public office before, that sort of thing. And so you have way more amateurs at the local level than you do at the state or national level. It's a matter of prestige, really. Most people, the public that is, are not even aware who the public officials are um, at the local level. Sometimes they'll know the mayor, or sometimes they'll have some idea who their representative is, but for the most part, they don't follow the politics the same way they would. So as a result, at the national, they don't follow politics the way they would the national, and that's just kind of how it goes. So if it's less prestigious, it's going to be more amateur. That is, you're going to draw people who are less likely to want to stay there and so on. A second characteristic is it's part-time. Most people in local politics, certainly this is not their job. They have another daytime job, and then they do this as a kind of volunteer activity, like volunteering at the hospital or belonging to some organization that does volunteer work in some capacity. Um, so it's very part time. There's little or no money. Sometimes they're paid by meetings. That's called per diem, where they're paid by meetings. Otherwise, they're not paid at all. So there isn't much of a salary. Whereas if you go to national politics, everybody is full time, and as a result, they're making pretty good money, comparable to what you would find in the private sector. But at the local level, there really is no money, and it is just strictly volunteering for civic duty or something along those lines. Like I said before, it's a place you start in politics. Local politics is where most people start and most people end, but certainly you don't have if you look at a city council or you look at county board or something like that, most of those people don't have a lot of political experience. And because of that, they tend to be led, very much so, led by whoever has the experience. A lot of times that's a city attorney or somebody like that, a manager, um, city manager or county manager, or somebody along those lines that is considered to be the more expert, and so they don't really become experts in their own right. They don't really have time to do it, both in terms of the amount of time that they serve or the amount of time that they have to devote to it during the time they're in office. It's quite a bit different than, say, national politics, where public officials who go to the House or Senate are really kind of permanent jobs. The incumbents get elected and reelected, and they become kind of expert in the committees that they work, and they make plenty of money, so they essentially are full time. So it's quite the contrast. It's quite the opposite of what you find at the national level. It's informal. They run very informally. It's not like the House of Representatives or the Senate, where formal rules have a lot to do with how they move about every day and how legislation gets passed. Oftentimes, they'll talk out of order. They'll talk about things that aren't germane to the topic. Um, it all depends on how well the leader of the city council, for example, is running the show. But for the most part, it's very informal. You can talk when you want, introduce legislation when you want. There isn't a whole lot of rules that they go by. And the last thing is that they're dominated by a few. I kind of hinted at this when I said that the people with the most experience, and oftentimes that's a lawyer or a planner or some agency head that shows up to talk about some particular issue that they're going to vote on. Those people who are the more expertise and have the more experience are more likely to be influential. So the most of the council, even though most councils are small, most of the people on the council tend to be kind of sheep-like in the sense that they just kind of follow along with whatever the leaders want. There's some exceptions to that, like if it's some issue that's really burning in the public attention, like a tax increase or something along those lines. But for the most part, when it comes to the day-to-day activities, just a few people lead the way, sometimes only one person, and everybody else is just kind of a follower, kind of a pattern for life, I think. Number two, what's a nonpartisan election, and why do we have them mainly at the local level? Well, a nonpartisan election means that there's no parties on the ballot, only candidates' names. So when you go to vote, you're just seeing the candidate's name on the ballot, and you don't know if they're a Democrat or Republican or what they are. The reason we have these nonpartisan elections is the second thing. It's the product of the reform movement. At the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a reform movement that kind of tried to get what was called good government, good politics into operation. And it had some influence, and it had a special influence at the local level. And there were a number of things that they advocated, like the city manager form of government, nonpartisan elections, things like that, which they thought were going to improve politics, make it so that the parties and the political machines that operated at the local level in big cities, that none of that their power would be diminished if they could put these structural reforms in, like nonpartisan elections. So in other words, the idea would be people would focus more attention on who the candidates were rather than the parties. Keep in mind that at the beginning of the 20th century, political parties were much stronger than they are now, and there wasn't television, and people were essentially voting either Democrat or Republican rather than voting the candidates. So the reform movement thought that you put in these nonpartisan elections and you'd improve things so that people would focus on the candidates and the issues, and they would diminish the power of political machines and political parties. It also was seen as a way to end corruption as well. I think the reformers, although they had some significance all the way up until about 1950, that reform movement had a lot of significance at the local level. I think they tended to be naive. I think anybody who's walking around saying that they're going to, um, end corruption or that they're going to lower the cost of government, you better watch out for them because they don't really know what they're talking about. Those things seem to be part and parcel of how government works. And I'm not just saying that because I've spent my life in Illinois and now in New Mexico, two of the most corrupt places I've ever seen. But anyway, it just seems like that's a really difficult thing to do, to end corruption. But they thought that, and certainly by doing these reforms, like a city manager government or nonpartisan election, something like that, would really not end corruption at all. I think they were too naive for their own good. Anyway, but that was the goal: end corruption and end political machines. We hardly see any semblance of political machines anymore. Chicago was the last of it, and really the last of it through the original Mayor Daley, not the son, who you might know better, came along many years after his father. Anyway, it was the first Mayor Daley who really had a powerful machine. If you ever read the book Boss, um, by Reichel, that's an excellent book on how machines operate and what makes them tick and all that stuff. So you might be able to find it in paperback somewhere. That's a really good book. Anyway, that's the last time we saw a real political machine, was what Reichel was talking about in Boss. Also, it creates issue-oriented campaigns. At least that's what they thought. That nonpartisans would create issue-oriented campaigns instead of party-oriented. So in other words, that people would be voting the issues, political issues of the day, rather than the parties. See, the feeling was that political parties blind people, that they'll vote for anybody as long as, if they're a Democrat, they'll vote for any Democrat, and if they're a Republican, they'll vote for any Republican. And they don't pay attention to whether the candidates are any good or what issues they stand for or anything like that. At least that's how it was perceived at the beginning of the 20th century. And so they figured that these kind of things like nonpartisanship would change that. And it would be a way to attract good candidates. The sense was that better people would be willing to run if you didn't have to be part of the Democrats or be part of the Republicans. That argument is made almost every time there's a structural reform. They've said that about appointing judges, that you get better judges because they wouldn't have to run for office. There's no proof to that at all, just like there's no proof that there's an end of corruption by nonpartisanship either. But anyway, those are the arguments made for and reasons why we have nonpartisan elections. Number three is is there 86,000 governments at the local level? You've got one national government and one state government in each state. So you've got one national government and 50 state governments, but you got 86,000 local governments. So how do we get there? What's the source of that? Why do we have so many of them? When you count up cities and counties, you don't have more than a few thousand. I think there's just 20,000 that could be called like cities and towns, something like that, in 6,000 counties throughout the whole United States. But when we come up with thousands, 60 to 80,000, 86,000 local governments, most of them are going to be special districts. And special districts are governments that are set up for a single purpose. They usually don't have an executive at the top. Usually they're just a council, a legislative branch that runs it, and they're designated for a single purpose. Mostly we see them in transportation for one area. So you have like the RTA in Illinois, the Regional Transportation Authority, and that's a special district that runs transportation. It's responsible for public transportation, just public transportation, not roads and stuff, but trains, buses and cabs and so on, the public transportation that people use. And so they regulate it to the extent that they raise money, they tax, and they also spend money on the essentially buses and trains. So you get special districts where each function, almost any function, every function has special districts, and that's why you have so many governments. Why we set these up? Instead of just giving the power over to, say, the existing local governments like the city of Chicago or the city of Joliet or someplace like that, why do we set up a special government just to run some single function? Another one that is real obvious is education. You have a special district that runs the district educational public school system. So you have maybe they cover a district will cover, a school district will cover something like some maybe 4 or 5 grade schools and a couple of high schools or one high school. It depends on what's in the geographical area. But you have these special districts for education, and you have that all over the country. Um, and you get them for just about every single function, but those are two of the real common ones. And why do we create them instead of just turning the power over to existing local governments? The answer is a way to deflect new taxes. The local governments, like the city of Chicago or the county of Cook or city of Joliet, doesn't want to tax its own people, be responsible for taxing the people to pay for public transportation in their area. So this is a kind of good way. Nobody's really paying much attention to the RTA or any of these other special districts. So they get to kind of tax, and at the same time, then the mayor of Joliet or the mayor of Chicago can say, I didn't charge you any new taxes because the new taxes coming out of the special districts. So that's a reason why they do it. Also, it's a way to distribute the tax burden. The RTA is over, I think, a 6-county area in Chicago, including Cook County. Now, most of the public transportation expenses are in Chicago. So you have the best and biggest train system or L system and buses and so on, because Chicago by far is the biggest city, the most dense population of people in Illinois. So they're spending most of the money, but the tax burden isn't just in Cook County. It isn't just the city, people who live in the city of Chicago paying for transportation in the city of Chicago. It's all the people in the surrounding counties in that 6-county area that's called the RTA. So you can go out as far as Kendall County, which is not far, I think, from Lewis, and those people in Kendall County are paying for public transportation in Chicago because it's part of the RTA. Now they do stick some buses. Certainly the buses that come to Lewis are part of the RTA, but it hardly warrants the kind of money that's being paid by citizens out in the boonies or the outskirts of Chicago, paying for the public transportation. So the burden is shared by all these people instead of just paid for by residents of Cook County. Another thing is a lack of public scrutiny. Public officials like to keep the public um, uninformed. They don't ever say that, but that's really the truth. They like to see both the newspapers and TV stations and the public itself unaware of what's really going on, because that way they don't get a lot of heat for what they do. If they're not working hard, and a lot of public officials aren't, they don't work long hours and so on. If they're not doing that, like for example, a typical example is judges. A lot of judges don't have, they're always saying their court docket is full and all that kind of thing, but they take breaks, uh, long breaks for lunch often. The jury selection process is way longer than it should be and drawn out, and all kinds of things that are going on in the judicial system that need reform. And the public is just really kind of not aware of all that. They're not aware of the expenses and how much money is being spent, nor are they aware of the time that's wasted. So the lack of public scrutiny is compounded by special districts, because people have no idea of what these districts are. I bet if you went and asked people what the RTA stood for, they'd have no idea. Or any of the special districts, or if you ask people, did you know that your public educational system in your area is run by a government that just deals with education? Hell, in Illinois, there's something called a mosquito abatement district, and their job is to kill mosquitoes. So you got a government that does nothing but kill mosquitoes. I mean, talk about level of insanity. Why would you do this? You do this because you want it enables the existing general purpose governments like cities to avoid the costs. That's all. And anyway, the last thing is there's very little media coverage of this. I think very few people who are journalists, and you have fewer and fewer of those people around anymore who are experienced at writing for a newspaper or reporting on television or whatever, that in essence the media coverage of special districts is pretty much non-existent. One of the things that is a real scandal in the city of Chicago is there's a special district that is set up to promote baseball in Chicago, and they pay for, among other things, the building of Sock Park. Now they never built a new park for the Cubs. They just built onto it. But if you go to the South Side, that's a real scandal, because you have that Sports Authority, a special district, and they essentially paid for the White Sox a new park, and there's restaurants and so on that are privately owned that were paid for by the government. It's unbelievable. You should check that out. It's just a typical example of the problem of special districts that the public and the media know almost nothing about, how this element of government is conducted. Number 4, the last one, why does so few people vote in local elections? So if you look at it, it's like a hierarchy. More people vote at the national level, and then typically it goes down somewhat for state government, and then local government is the lowest, the least amount of turnout. So there's a lot of reasons. Let me give you some of them here. Lack of media coverage. There isn't a lot of media left, for one thing, and that's a problem. Like newspapers used to be back in the day when I was a young adult. Chicago had several newspapers. I think there was maybe 7 newspapers in Chicago, and there were different editions of the newspapers. Now it's down to 2, the Sun-Times and the Tribune, and even at that, back in the day, there used to be editions of those papers. So a lot of people read the newspaper. They got their local news from the newspaper. And that stopped, you know. People just, with television, they stopped reading the paper. Like the paper couldn't keep up with television. Television has breaking news and all of that. I think people got lazy too, that they started to think that I can get just as much news out of watching TV as I can reading the paper, when the reality is that the amount of news you see on a nightly newscast on television can fit on one side, one page of a newspaper. So the lack of media coverage is in part because there's fewer media, fewer newspapers and magazines that are devoted to politics. Um, and they almost never cover local, except when we're talking about big cities or except when we're talking about scandals. Other than that, they tend not to really talk about it much. Um, a second thing is a lack of voter interest. The voters are mainly, and again, this is all fed by the fact that they have, the voters have media coverage of national politics rather than local. So there's much more of a lack of interest in it. Um, it just seems like you know, that there also is a lack of prestige too. Um, Local politics doesn't have much prestige, and as a result, the public doesn't think they're doing anything important. The sense is that what's really going on that's important is at the national level, and then maybe secondarily the state, but not the local. The local are just fooling around, talking about parking or talking about some mundane thing that really isn't really significant. Um, Another thing, of course, is incumbency dominated. Very few new people have an opportunity to really win if the incumbent wants to stay on. Now, incumbents oftentimes quit more often at the local level than they do at the national or state, but that's because of choice. So if they want to stay on, they usually can. And so there's a dominancy, and this is at all levels of incumbents. Um, One party or nonpartisan elections. If there's nonpartisan elections, and we talked a little bit about that earlier about nonpartisanship, um, that tends to reduce the numbers of people that show up rather than get people to vote based on um, issues or candidates. So instead, it just reduces the turnout. And one party domination, you see a lot of that at the local level, either like the Democrats are in Chicago and there are no real Republican opposition. And then you go out in the suburbs, it's the opposite, where the Republicans dominate and the Democrats are really not in opposition. That tends to reduce the turnout as well. If there's strong two-party competition, more people show up. A lack of campaigning is another thing. You don't find campaigns like you do at the national and state level where candidates are spending huge amounts of money and they're on television and they're running all kinds of ads and everything. All of that stuff has a tendency to get people who aren't interested in the first place to become interested. And when you don't have that kind of campaigning going on, they never get interested. Lack of issue importance. That, like I said, there's a sense that they're important and significant issues are handled by the national government, and then everything else kind of trickles down. And by the time you get down to local, they're not really doing anything of significance. Um, Another thing is elections are held at odd times. Oftentimes they're in the winter. They're whenever you sort of got a time to do it, um, when the national or state isn't running an election. And so they kind of take a back seat. So the end result is that few people vote in national elections, but I mean at the local in local elections, and you know, there's a number of reasons for it. The main one being lack of interest and lack of media coverage. Okay, I think that's enough.